this episode of Heritage Hunters.
Everyone at some point or another gets to 1890 and may be stuck, and we want to help you get unstuck. There was a fire at one of the locations where the census records were held, and the records were destroyed. And there wasn't what we talk about these days in contemporary times about backup copies.
0.01% still exists, and it's just for a small amount from certain states.
Using the 1890 tragedy gives you an opportunity to turn it into a happy place.
Hi, I'm Barbara.
And I'm Hope. And we
are
the Heritage Hunters.
Each month, we will bring you real stories from real people researching their genealogy and family history to inspire you on your genealogical journey.
Hi, my name is Kate Townsend. I am a certified genealogist. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I've been conducting genealogical research since I was 16 years old when I went to the National Archives on a high school field trip and immediately thought, okay, I'm going to discover my family history in one day. And that's obviously not the case. And this summer, I'm really excited that I will be a co-course coordinator with my colleague Cecelia McFadden at the Genealogical Research Institute of Pittsburgh, here in Pittsburgh, my hometown.
I'm so glad that we're here to talk a little bit about the Institute in Pittsburgh. GRIP's been going on for a number of decades. One of the premier opportunities for genealogical education for people that are interested from beginner to advanced. There's something there for everyone. Having an in-person opportunity, I know since we're in the endemic times, post-pandemic, people have been taking advantage of virtual opportunities, but there's nothing like an in-person institute where people have an opportunity to connect, grow in their experiences and their learning, and deep dive into a particular topic. So the things that Kate and I are going to be coordinating the Institute and this particular course, the 1890 U.S. Census, Surrogates and Substitutes, it's a great way to help people understand what exactly is available when you run into brick walls and you are missing records, and everyone at some point or another gets to 1890 and may be stuck, and we want to help you get unstuck.
The 1890 census certainly is one of the most frustrating, albeit fascinating, gaps in American history. It's wonderful that you've come up with some ways to short circuit that.
Well, I think some of the methodology that we'll employ is studying the era of 1890 in and of itself, because we're in the Gilded Age in 1890, so there's a vast economic disparity between people in the United States. There's also a huge influx of immigration and industrialization. We're also about 25 years after the end of the Civil War and emancipation. So there's like a lot of great change in the country. And with that, there's a lot of records that are becoming more ubiquitous during this time that we're going to talk about using as a substitute. So for instance, vital records in some jurisdictions that weren't recording them already start to do early vital records. So we're going to talk about looking at those records, also looking at church records. I'll be giving a presentation on something that I'm really passionate about, and that's looking at employment records and really studying the industry of blue-collar workers, a lot of which were immigrants. And then we're going to have Alec Ferretti, who's an expert in immigration records, talk about the law behind immigration and naturalization in the era of 1890, particularly because additional measures were implemented federally in 1893 so that passenger list records are more helpful during that time period. So we're going to try to get into all of those details.
Sounds wonderful. Let's back up just a little bit first and let's explain to the audience what actually happened to the 1890 federal population census, if you can give us an overview of that.
So for people that don't know, every census, every decennially since 1790, the United States of America, by law, takes account of the population. So every 10 years, federal government goes out and commissions a census to count all the population. There may or may not be opportunities to do additional surveys at that time, but it's really important to get the total population count of people in the states and territories. So in 1890, the same thing happened. But as we started to centralize the federal government and understand, as we started to grow as a nation, we started to accumulate records. And there wasn't really a strategy, so to speak, or a plan as to where we would keep the records and store the records. And so sometimes it would be in one building or another. We didn't have a centralized location, and things moved forward. And then we didn't always, everyone didn't have a curating, preservationist attitude towards those things. And so, unfortunately, there was a fire at one of the locations where the census records were held, and the records were destroyed. And there wasn't what we talk about these days in contemporary times about backup copies, et cetera, et cetera. And so the records were destroyed. There was a time where states would keep copies of their records when they would send them to Washington, D.C., but some decades had passed since the 1890 census had been taken, and people decided, hey, we were good, and got rid of those as well. And so here we had this situation. So they were destroyed, and wasn't really much people could do about it except talk about what happened. And we have a lot of documentation of what the preparation was and the planning for the census. But as to what would happen to the records, they were destroyed by fire, water damage, you name it, it happened. And then we were without the census.
So what parts of it still exist?
I believe 0.01% still exists, and it's just for a small amount from certain states. So I think I've seen what records from Washington, D.C. I think there's some from Illinois, perhaps I've seen Alabama, but it's just like small sections of those records. I believe that there was like an initial fire, like Cecelia was talking about, and then a lot of the records were destroyed by water damage, like Cecelia mentioned, but then they became moldy and were ultimately just purposely destroyed by the government because they weren't salvageable.
So maybe something a little under 6,500 records, actual records actually exist. Not very many at all, right?
In England, the 1931 Census of England and Wales was also destroyed by a fire. So this isn't a problem that's unique to the United States, but it's one that's tragic nonetheless, to put it in perspective.
Hi everyone, this is Barbara from Heritage Hunters. I'm excited to tell you about our local genealogy interest group, Lower Bucks Genealogists. What sets us apart is our roundtable format. Rather than a traditional lecture-style meeting, we create an interactive environment where everyone gets a chance to share what they're working on or ask questions about the challenges they're facing in their research. This collaborative approach allows us to learn from each other's experiences and expertise. Whether you're a seasoned genealogist or just starting your family history journey, you'll find our meetings are a great way to connect with other like-minded individuals, exchange ideas, and get the support you need to advance your research. Founded in 2008, Lower Bucks Genealogists is a thriving community of individuals united by a shared passion for uncovering their family's past. At the heart of our mission is a dedication to helping others preserve their family histories. We believe that every family story is worth recording and celebrating. By connecting genealogists from around the world, we strive to facilitate the discovery and preservation of family legacies. We warmly invite you to become a part of our growing community. As a member, you'll not only gain valuable resources and support for your genealogical research, but you'll also find yourself among a group of like-minded individuals who share your passion for exploring the past. Together, we can work to promote the joy of tracing family histories and uncovering the stories that have shaped our lives. We meet the second Saturday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern via Zoom. Send me a message for the Zoom link, and I look forward to seeing you at our next meeting.
So we talk about those things in the course. There's several ways. So I think Kate's alluded to some of the things. We had a lot of immigration and mobility and activities. So that's one of the ways that we will have Alec Ferretti focus on that. One of the other things that was happening and very prominent after the Civil War is we had a lot of, I call it a religious renaissance. So a lot of different religious activity surrounding various sects and denominations, right? So we didn't have this monolithic approach to spirituality. And as denominations grew, they started to keep records. And so talk about how you can leverage church records, and we'll use Sonny Morton to help us work through and deliver some skill sets and how you can leverage and mine church repositories and records and denominational records to help find your ancestors. Another way to look at things at that time, Kate mentioned records that started to come online from a compliance perspective. So vital records. That's another opportunity. States being able to mandate that there are birth and death records. Those started to come online across the countries in various states. And that may be one way to, again, try to find your ancestors in those records, which were just coming online and are essential. Another thing that we would look at is state censuses. So states decided to count themselves too, not that they didn't trust the federal government, but there was another opportunity to show the growth and prosperity in some of the states. And so state censuses, they took surveys on the fives usually. So where the censuses are on the zeros every 10 years, state census records are usually on the fives. And so we talk about a little bit about how those can be leveraged, because it's not just the count of that particular year, but the additional questions. Where did you live 5 years ago? If you were looking at a census, you will find out where your family moved and if they were there before. Same way we talk about mining the 1900 census for clues about 1890, because there are questions about if you had moved and if people had moved. So there are other ways to close that gap, but you would do extrapolation. So some of the methods, as you mentioned, or what are the things that we would be leveraging and showing people how to techniques and skills to build in that regard, so that you could recover from the missing 1890 experience.
How useful do you feel that the Civil War pension schedules are for the 1890 census as a substitute?
The Civil War pension files for Civil War soldiers, I think that they can be extremely helpful just in general, because sometimes a soldier would list out where they were married, all of their children's names. I've even seen extracts of church records from abroad that were used to substantiate a marriage between a husband and wife, subsequent with a widow's pension. Additionally, you'll have addresses and letters in those records on occasion. You'll also have affidavits from doctors talking about like the condition of the soldiers that can give a location of where the doctor was located. So I think that they can be extremely valuable if you do have a Civil War ancestors, where sometimes I have people come to me and they say that they've identified that pension index card on Ancestry or Family Search, but they don't know that behind that one record, you could potentially get 100+ pages of records about your Civil War ancestor, and then those can be used to fill in those gaps. So I think it's something that's definitely essential and really interesting too, just to learn more about somebody who served in the Civil War. But I find it most helpful when I get those pages where someone lists out their marriages, where they were married by whom, and their children's names, because that's just genealogical gold.
I would love to find something like that. Do you think that there are any underutilized resources to bridge the gap?
One thing that I do think is underutilized and we'll be talking about in the course is city directory records, not just looking at 1 year, but looking at a span of 30+ years for one ancestor and making a timeline with those city directory records. Now, this isn't always possible if your ancestor lived in a rural location, but if they live in a city where you can go year by year, you have to do it. And even if they lived in a rural location, sometimes county directories or even for smaller city directories would be done every 2 or every 5 years. So there's still something there. But I like to track migrations and movements during this time with city directory records. And they can also be used to reconstruct households, because if you have a father, and sometimes you'll have women later, particularly if they owned a business in a city directory and they have children that say above 16 or 17. Sometimes they'll be listed with their occupation and an address, and you can reconstruct households from there. So those are one of my favorite record types, but it's not something that I think everyone talks about. Just doing the work and finding the records if they're available for a 30-year period to reconstruct a household and to track the changes.
What's your favorite story of somebody overcoming the 1890 gap?
I think one of my favorite stories is recently I did a giant timeline for about a 50 to 60 year period for a family, including where I did that city directory research because the family was in a urban location. I looked at property records, vital records, church records, really all the types of records that we're going to be going into detail with during the course of our course, and put it together in a timeline and tracked those changes. So I identified things like the family moved away to Ohio for a time from Pittsburgh that would have been absent had I not put all that information together in the timeline. And that's something else that we're going to be talking about in the course, is really putting it all together in a timeline. So I think it's stories like that where I do, I think, a good job at reasonably exhaustive research, correlating evidence, and putting it all together to reestablish these families. Because when I do that, the 1890 census loss, which is still awful, feels a little bit less awful because I'm putting all the pieces together and I'm able to see a picture of the family as a whole.
I think that one of the other things that often overlooked, we're only talking about specific counties that survived. And I think it's 11 states, right? Less than 1%, 11 states and the District of Columbia. So we're only talking about select counties. You made a good point earlier in the dialogue in our discussion when you talked about the pension files. But what's really important about what survived in 1890 is the census of the Union veterans and the widows. So that's a complete perspective of what's going on. The population at the time of the census was 62 million. We had a little 62,700,000 United States citizens or people in the United States at the time, not all citizens per se. But it gives you kind of you can extrapolate some of the things that Kate is talking about. So out of that percentage, we get a kind of idea of what things were like 3 decades post-civil. The other thing that I think is overlooked, there is some congressional, gives us some opportunity to talk about what did Congress say after the fire. The fire took place in 1921. It took 12 years for them to decide what to do with the records. And you can go into the congressional bank and see what they decided to do. Ultimately, in 1933, making the decision to destroy the records, as Kate mentioned. By then, they had been molded. They weren't excited what they were going to plan to do. And so understanding what the congressional Congress had to say about it gave you an idea of the petitions and the concerns that you had at various states. Our representatives, the leaders of the states, had to say about this very important thing that didn't happen and what they tried to do for the Census Bureau to understand or make up the gap. And then they just finally decided to destroy things in 33.
GRIP Genealogy Institute is the event for genealogists and family historians who want to develop their skills while meeting new friends in a collegial and collaborative community. GRIP offers 2 separate program options. The 2026 course offerings include a selection of 19 different courses to choose from. Students choose 1 course for the week. There will be 9 virtual courses offered from June 22nd through 26th. 8 in-person courses offered from July 12th through 17th, and 2 special courses offered in the fall. For more information, visit grip.ngsgenealogy.org.
If the 1890 census had survived, how different would that make genealogy today?
I think it would just make things more comprehensive and a little bit easier during that period. When I look at the surviving records, what strikes me a lot is that for parents and of an individual enumerated, plus for them, I've seen a lot more like exact places of birth listed for everyone on those records than I ever have on any other census enumeration. All the clues that are within that enumeration would make things easier. Cecilia, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do for quote unquote newly minted formerly enslaved people and freedom seekers, and to have two successive censuses to see how the progress in a segment of the population that had been oppressed for a period of time would have been, I think that speaks volumes, because a lot of things related to those families just start to emerge in 1870. And so you only get one count, and then we know that people moved a lot because people wanted a fresh start. And so then we have this big gap, and then we have 1900. So had 1890 survived, I think there have been a lot less opportunity for this kind of unknown experience. You get a kind of more of a trend, but you still would need to start reestablishing a trend. And by 1900, we had huge waves of migration for people of color out of the South. But maybe 1890, understanding the clue of when that just started to happen, as opposed to what was going on by 1910, which was just an explosion. We may have gotten an idea or a handle about those origins and what that means for different parts of the South, whether it be the South, the Mississippi, the folks from Florida. It's all different, the upper South migration and that kind of thing. Get a handle of that before it, for lack of a better word, just exploded without those kind of understandings. And maybe it's different with that north-south pattern of people of color versus the east-west pattern for people who are coming into the ships of call, the ports of call, and going straight west from the territory. Maybe it's a literacy thing, not sure, like a crisscross. We will see things in records that talk about a north-south migration more so with that group, as opposed to the eastward-westward migration that was happening in general for a lot of the rest of the U.S. population. So I think that's something interesting. 1870 would have just been the first post-Civil War where we would have an enumeration, obviously a first name and last name. And by people being liberated, they may have opted not to take the name of the slave owner. They may have just changed their name completely. And we didn't have courts the way we do name changes now. So people could just go in the next census, whoever they were, irrespective of race. And in the 1870 census, they were Eli Lilly. And in the 1818 census, they were Abraham Lincoln. And so people were able to do that. That's why the court stepped up and said, not so fast. We want to kind of regulate name changes, because this is what people did. You wanted a fresh start. I need a new name too. So if I move into Nebraska, I'm going to leave the Ohio name in Ohio and I'm going to Nebraska. It's all brand new for me. And many families did this. It wasn't just people of color.
How do you think DNA plays into bridging the gap of the 1890 census? Do you think DNA helps at all?
I personally don't do DNA professionally. It's more of a hobby for me, but I think it definitely can bridge the gap because even in my own family, when I'm just looking at my own DNA, I'm able to see connections between people before and after like that time of the 1890 census. And when you supplement it from with documentary evidence, I think you certainly can bridge the gap, but it's not something that I feel like I have a particular expertise in.
I don't do DNA, nothing professionally with DNA, but what I wanted to point out with now that Ancestry is starting to offer some other kind of capabilities in terms of those DNA communities, that would be something to see what those patterns look like, because you can time elapse those communities within Ancestry. And if you belong to those communities, leverage your test results within the community migrations that they show in those breakdowns in the estimates, and leverage those to make some coverage gaps for 1890, I think is very plausible.
What else do you feel comfortable telling us about your program?
One thing that we haven't mentioned is we're going to have an in-person archival research experience on the Wednesday in our course at the University of Pittsburgh's Archives and Records Center, where David Grinnell, an archivist there, is going to be talking to us about the collections there. And we're also going to have an opportunity for students to practice hands-on archival research with us there, which I think is a great research field trip and something that's unique. And I think it underscores the importance of in-person education, because often I'm going to an archive by myself to look at records, but I think it's great to go with a group of people and to learn from one another. And I think that's true for the whole week. So that's something that I think people definitely shouldn't miss.
When is GRIP this year?
It's July 12th to 17th. And then there's also a virtual session in June, but we will be in person in Pittsburgh on the 12th. There's a kickoff event and like orientation, and then it really starts on Monday, July 13th to Friday, July 17th, which is a little bit of a shorter day.
And can you tell the audience how they can join up for GRIP?
You can go to the National Genealogical Society's website. When you get there, it's going to ask you to log in or continue as a guest, and then you can go and search for a GRIP session to purchase. When you get to the National Genealogical Society website, that's where you actually register, but there's a separate for the Genealogical Research Institute of Pittsburgh, which is grip.ngsgenealogy.org. And all the details, including when our classes are, like when all the sessions are, who's teaching the sessions, are available on that website.
Have we covered everything that you wanted to share with us?
The other thing I would just add, remember I talked to you about counties. We have 1890 only had counties, that remnants across 11 states. We also have some coursework that talks to you about how to search county records for in that time frame, and land records, some understanding about deeds and land records and state land records, so that you can use plat maps to find families. We'll be covering that as well, and I think that's an important tool set to have in addition to the things that we've talked about so far today. I think we cover the whole thing, and we do the law as well. I forgot about that. So any kind of legal pursuits, how to find records in courts at that time. You may find your family in court, and not necessarily a bad thing, but just in court dockets for a variety of reasons. We'll spend some time talking about how courts are organized, where you might be able to find an indexing of listing of family of records of people who were on court dockets, and that may lead you some other clues about your ancestors. So I think those things all in and of itself give you a comprehensive horizon of what you can do for surrogates and substitutes. And then using the 1890 tragedy gives you an opportunity to turn it into a happy place with some of the things that we're going to show you. So we won't make it a tragedy anymore if you join us.
I think it's a great opportunity. I'm excited to dive into this topic, and I think going in depth on a lot of these record resources and research strategies will help your research in general, not just with the 1890 census. And we have a great faculty who will be joining us. We have Judy Russell, Alec Ferretti, Sunny Morton, and Sydney Cruz, as well as David Grinnell from the University of Pittsburgh. So some really good lectures and people with great expertise.
I want to thank you so much for coming and talking to us tonight about the 1890 census and sharing your program with the audience. We really hope that you have a wonderful turnout, and we would love to have you come back and let us know how it was.
That would be awesome. And we can tell you how the research field trip was. And if you want to drive quickly to Pittsburgh, you're more than welcome to.
Thank you for joining us today on Heritage Hunters. This has been a CNC production, recorded and mixed by me, Barbara May. We would like to thank our guests for sharing their genealogical experiences and personal stories.
Be sure to visit us on our webpage, heritage-hunters.com, and our many social media pages such as Facebook, Twitter, Locals, and more. Please leave us a review, like our page, and follow us to be sure to never miss our show. If you'd like to be on the show or have an idea for an upcoming episode, please email us at heritage.hunters@gmail.com, and that's the number 2, heritage.hunters@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
Remember to like and subscribe to our podcast. We hope you'll join us next month on Heritage Hunters. This has been a CNC production.